May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So my 2-year-old niece, Mary, has recently learned a new phrase, which she is employing with great regularity. Given the fact that she's 2, you might expect that the word no figures prominently in this. And indeed it does. Mary's new phrase is no, me do, as in, Mary, can I put on your jacket? No, me do. Mary, can I put on your shoes? No, me do. Mary, can I take off your jacket? No, me do. Which is fine if you have 45 minutes to wait for a toddler to get dressed to go to the grocery store. But most of the time it ends up with quite an argument between Mary and her parents about what she's wearing or not wearing. Mary is starting to explore her own self-sufficiency in the world, what she's able to do and what she's not able to do yet, which is something that we all do through our lives. As we grow from being children to being adults, we are always pushing those boundaries of our own self-sufficiency, of our own abilities, of what we can do and not do. And I think part of our growing older and our gaining of wisdom is beginning to understand the importance of the communities around us, those people that support us and lift us up. Because one step further from self-sufficiency, I think, is the danger of isolation. Because once we reach isolation, our decision-making isn't always as good, and we may find ourselves in places that we really don't want to be. And I had a bunch of those experiences when I was working for the Bishop of Massachusetts, because in our office we had files of every single clergy person in the diocese. Most of them just have letters and other things in them. They weren't that important. In the other locked room were the red files. And the red files were those files of clergy who had gotten into trouble somehow. Mostly the bishop had had to discipline someone for writing checks out of their discretionary funds in inappropriate ways. Those who had perhaps done something that was unbecoming of a clergy person. But if you took the time to go back and listen to the stories of those priests, they almost all started in isolation and a belief that that clergy person didn't need anybody else's input or help, or that he or she had gotten so isolated and unable to even reach out at that point that they started to make really poor decisions. They had gotten to the point where they couldn't even ask God for help anymore because they were so set in that place. And I think that's where we find Jesus in the gospel this morning. We hear the temptation in the desert, which we hear every single year on the first Sunday of Lent. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all write about this story, so it must have been really important to them. They really wanted to communicate what was happening with Jesus at the beginning of his ministry. And we're really familiar with the story of the devil coming to Jesus. But the devil doesn't come right away. The devil doesn't come the day after Jesus gets baptized. The devil waits 40 days until Jesus is tired and hungry and isolated, has been away from his community and his family for a period of time, has been forced to just rely on himself. And because of that, Jesus is vulnerable. That's when the devil appears and comes and says, if you're hungry, turn the stones to bread. You can do it. You're the Son of God. Why are you sitting here hungry? Jesus is isolated. Jesus is tired. Jesus is open to the suggestion of the devil. Jesus is perhaps not able to make the best decisions. And the devil continues to tempt him. Continues to say, you don't need anybody else. You don't need any help. You don't need any community. In fact, the devil's really even saying, Jesus, you don't need God. You can do it yourself. You can turn the stones to bread. You can have all the kingdoms of the world. It's all about you, Jesus. You can be in charge. You can be making all the decisions. You can be the one who's important. Now, I think if most of us had those options, we'd be sitting back going, I don't know, that sounds like some pretty good possibilities to me. And if you were isolated, if you were away from family and friends and community and support, you certainly might be tempted to take that opportunity, to make that poor decision, to go along with what the devil was inviting you to do. But Jesus, of course, resists all the temptations in spite of the isolation, in spite of the hunger, in spite of the trials that he had been through. He sends the devil away. And what's really interesting about this story is that while this pits just Jesus against the devil, and we get this sense that Jesus is strong and Jesus is powerful, do you know what happens next in the gospel? He goes out and he calls his disciples. He calls that community to be around him. He calls those close companions to share with him the joys and the trials, to work with him and live with him, to keep him from being isolated. Jesus recognizes that it's too hard for him to do on his own. He can't do it by himself. He must have other people around to keep him walking on the path with God, to keep him making the decisions that serve God, that serve the community, that keep him walking on the proper path. And I think this is one of the great lessons for us in this gospel reading. This reminder to us how it is so easy for us to become isolated. How it is so easy for us to think, we can do it by ourselves. We don't need anybody else. And in fact, our culture reinforces that. We hear, well, he's a self-made man, or you just need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You don't need anybody else. I can go it alone. We even have God helps those who help themselves. But the truth of the matter is we can't. We are not built that way. Humans are built to live in companionship and community. We may spend short periods of time by ourselves or needing that bit of alone time. But the truth of the matter is, it is the communities that we build that strengthen us, that bear us up, that keep us on the proper path. And also help strengthen and heal our relationship with God. Help us recognize where God is inviting us and calling us. Reminding us that we were never intended to be alone. We were never intended to be isolated. We were never intended to do just what we want, when we want, and how we want. I think the spiritual practice here for us is one of learning how to reach out and ask for that help. To have the humility to say, I think I'm in trouble. I think I need some help. To trust our community enough to invite others into those places where we need another voice, where we need our community to lift us up, or perhaps put us back on the right track. So as you begin your Lenten observances, I would invite you to spend some time reflecting on where do you need to invite your community to support you, to care for you, to love you, to move you out of those places of isolation, to remind you of God's pervading love, to remind you that you're not meant to be alone, but that we are meant to be together. And in being together, we see the face of God, we see the life of God, and we experience that every time we lift one another up, where we see God in one another's face, and when we come together to praise and worship. Amen.